The shot came from nowhere. 1 second the forest was silent except for the soft crunch of boots on frozen leaves. The next, a violent crack split the air, and pain exploded through his thigh. His leg gave out instantly. He didn't scream. He didn't even have time to think. He just collapsed, face first, into the mud as bullets tore through the space where he'd been standing only moments before. This wasn't supposed to happen. The mission had been simple. Cross the enemy line under cover of darkness. Reach the extraction point before dawn. No firefights, no heroics, just information, and get out alive. But now he was wounded, bleeding, and lying alone in enemy territory. Somewhere in the trees, German voices shouted orders. Boots pounded the ground. Dogs barked. They knew someone was out here. He pressed his face into the dirt, forcing himself not to breathe too loudly. Every instinct screamed at him to move, but moving could mean death. The blood soaking into his pants was warm, too warm, and he knew enough to understand what that meant. If he didn't stop the bleeding, he wouldn't last the night. If he did move, they would hear him. This was the cruel reality of war. There were no second chances, no mercy, no reset, only decisions made in seconds that determined whether you lived or died. As the voices drew closer, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't just wounded, he was trapped, and he was being hunted. Stories of World War II often celebrate victory, bravery, and sacrifice. But many stories were never told, because the men who lived them never made it back to speak. This is one of those stories, not about generals or grand battles, but about a single soldier cut off from his unit, wounded behind enemy lines, facing a reality where survival depended not on strength, but on endurance, silence, and sheer will. As you listen, imagine this moment. Picture the darkness, the cold, the fear of knowing that every sound could be your last. And before we continue, take a moment to let me know where you're listening from. These stories connect people across borders, just as this war once did. If you're new here, subscribe for more real human stories of survival from history. Now, let's go back to the forest, to the night everything fell apart. He hadn't expected to be afraid. By the time you've been in combat long enough, fear changes shape. It becomes quieter, more controlled. You stop shaking before missions, not because you're brave, but because you've learned that panic wastes energy you can't afford to lose. His unit had been briefed just before sunset, a small reconnaissance operation. Intelligence suggested enemy troop movement near a supply route deep behind the front line. Command needed confirmation. Nothing more. The kind of mission designed to be invisible. 4 men went in. 4 were supposed to come back. They moved at dusk, slipping through broken terrain, scarred by shell craters and burned-out trees. No talking, no lights, just hand signals and memory. The map existed more in their heads than on paper. He remembered thinking how quiet everything felt. Too quiet. The deeper they went, the more wrong it felt. The forest seemed to swallow sound. Even the wind barely moved the branches. That silence pressed down on him, heavy and unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. They reached the observation point shortly after midnight. That was when things started to unravel. A flare went up in the distance, far enough not to be meant for them, close enough to raise alarm. Then another. German patrols were more active than intelligence had predicted. The radio crackled once, then died, no signal. Their leader made the call. Abort the mission. Fall back immediately. They turned, retracing their steps, but the forest had changed. Shadows looked unfamiliar. Paths that should have been clear were suddenly blocked by fallen debris. And then it happened. The ambush wasn't loud at first. No warning shot, no shouted challenge, just gunfire. Chaos erupted in seconds. 1 man went down immediately. Another disappeared into the darkness, yelling something that was lost in the noise. Orders were shouted, but no one knew who was where. He ran. Instinct took over. He sprinted between trees, heart pounding, lungs burning. Bullets snapped past him, tearing bark from trunks inches away. Then came the shot, the one that dropped him. As he lay there now, bleeding in the cold mud, those moments replayed in his mind. The mission, the decision to abort, the assumption that retreat meant safety. It didn't, and the most terrifying realization hadn't even hit him yet. He had no idea where the others were, or if they were even alive. He lay still long enough for his heartbeat to stop sounding like thunder in his own ears. The pain in his thigh pulsed in waves, hot, nauseating surges that made his vision tighten at the edges. He pressed his mouth into the mud to keep himself quiet, not out of discipline, out of necessity. One sharp breath, one involuntary groan, and the night would answer with a flashlight beam and a bullet. German voices moved through the trees in short bursts, commands, questions, angry replies. He understood almost none of it, but he didn't need translation. Tone did the job. They weren't searching casually, they were hunting. A dog barked again, closer this time. He forced his hands to work. First rule, stop the bleeding. He slid his palm down his leg and immediately felt warm wetness, too much of it. His fingers came away slick and dark. In the dim light, blood looked black like oil. The smell of earth mixed with iron filled his nose. He reached for his field dressing, kept in the same pocket every soldier kept it in, because you didn't want to think when you needed it. But his hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with the cold, with adrenaline, with the understanding that the body could only lose so much before it simply quit. He tore the packet open with his teeth. The sound was tiny, but he froze anyway, listening for any reaction. Nothing. Only the wind and the dog and boots in the distance. He pressed the dressing against the wound and bit down hard on the inside of his cheek when the pain flared. His leg jerked. He forced it still with his other hand, pinning it to the ground like it belonged to someone else. Pressure. Keep pressure. He wrapped the bandage tight, tighter than seemed reasonable, until the throbbing dulled into a deep ache. A tourniquet would have been faster, but a tourniquet meant risk. Too tight, too long, and you saved the mission only to lose the limb. He needed the leg. He needed it even if it screamed at him. The voices shifted, closer. He held his breath. A flashlight beam swept across a patch of trees ahead, then swung away. Another beam followed. He watched through a slit between roots and ferns, barely daring to blink. He could hear the dog now, not barking but breathing, sniffing, that wet, searching sound that turned the blood in his veins to ice. No. He pressed his face deeper into the mud, willing himself to become part of the ground. He remembered what an old sergeant had once told him. When you're outnumbered, don't be brave. Be invisible. The dog sniffing came closer, then stopped. A German voice snapped something sharp. The dog whined. Another command, firmer. The sniffing resumed, but it moved sideways, as if someone had tugged the leash away from his direction. He waited until his lungs burned before he allowed himself a tiny, controlled breath. For the first time since the shot, he let his mind ask the question he'd been avoiding. How did they get here so fast? Ambushes weren't random. Patrols didn't appear out of thin air. If the Germans were this organized, it meant they'd either been waiting or they'd been tipped off. A trap. The thought lodged like a splinter in his brain. His radio had died, his unit had scattered. He was bleeding, and the enemy was moving with the confidence of men who believed the outcome was already decided. He needed distance, he needed cover, he needed a plan. He turned his head slightly and scanned the ground. The forest floor wasn't flat, it dipped into a shallow depression where water collected, forming a dark, stagnant pool. Beyond that, he could see the suggestion of a fallen tree trunk, thick and moss-covered, lying like a low wall. If he could reach it, he could crawl behind it. Hide his silhouette, buy time. But every movement carried risk. He tested his leg with the smallest shift. Pain lanced up his body like electricity. He nearly blacked out, but he didn't make a sound. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood where he'd bitten his cheek. His hands trembled again. "You can't stay here." He began to move, not walking, not crawling like a man, crawling like an animal that understood it, existed purely to be killed. He dragged himself 1 inch at a time, pulling with his arms, letting his injured leg trail behind with minimal movement. Leaves stuck to his uniform. Mud smeared his sleeves. He felt the cold seeping into his chest, the kind of cold that made your thoughts slow and heavy. Halfway to the fallen trunk, he heard a metallic click, a rifle bolt. He froze instantly. A flashlight beam touched the ground 20 yards away. A voice barked an order. He watched boots step into view, 2 soldiers, rifles up, scanning. Their helmets caught the faint light like dull metal moons. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The beam swung closer. He pressed his hand into the mud and felt his pulse hammering through his fingers. The beam hit the depression. It shimmered on the water. For a moment the light reflected up, flaring his eyes. He wanted to close them but didn't dare. He kept staring, unblinking, as if staring could keep the light from finding him. The beam moved on. The soldier's boots shifted, crunching leaves. One of them laughed briefly, something casual, something that felt obscene in the darkness. Then they walked away. Only then did he realize his hands were cramped from holding still. He continued. When he reached the fallen trunk, he rolled behind it and pressed his back against the damp wood. His lungs filled slowly, carefully, as if oxygen itself could betray him. He checked his bandage, still wet, but not pouring. Good enough. Now the bigger problem. Where was he? He reached into his pocket for the small compass and the folded map that had already been dampened by sweat earlier. He opened it as quietly as he could, keeping it flat against the ground so the paper wouldn't rustle. The map was almost useless without landmarks in the dark. Trees all looked the same. But he remembered one feature from their approach, a narrow creek they'd crossed hours ago, and a broken stone wall that once marked a farm boundary. If he could find that wall, he could orient himself. If he could orient himself, he could move toward the extraction point, or at least toward friendly lines. But there was something else, something he hadn't accounted for. A low, rhythmic thump in the distance. At first, he thought it was artillery. Then he realized it was too steady. Engines. Vehicles. A convoy moving somewhere nearby, which meant roads, which meant supply lines, which meant the Germans had something worth guarding, and he was right in the middle of it. His mission may have been aborted, but the war hadn't stopped. He listened carefully. The convoy sound grew louder for a few moments, then faded, like it had passed behind a ridge or deeper into the woods. If he moved toward it, he risked being seen. But if he moved away, he might wander blind until dawn, and dawn would expose him. He stayed still again, weighing options with a mind that felt trapped inside a body it couldn't fully control. And then he heard it. Not voices, not boots, a single gunshot. Far off but distinct, then another, not random, spaced apart, like someone firing in response, his unit or a German patrol signaling. His stomach tightened. If one of his men was still alive out there, they might be drawing the enemy toward them, or the enemy might be using them as bait. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to think like a survivor and not like a teammate, because right now, loyalty could get you killed, but abandoning your men could haunt you forever if you lived long enough to be haunted. He made the decision with the kind of calm that only comes when the world is reduced to a single question. What keeps you alive until the next minute? He folded the map, slid it back into his pocket, and began moving again, deeper into the forest, toward the sound of the gunfire, toward the unknown, because whatever was happening out there, it was connected to why he'd been trapped in the first place, and he needed answers before the Germans found him again. He moved slowly, timing each motion to the sounds of the forest. When the wind picked up, he crawled. When a branch creaked somewhere else, he shifted his weight. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. The pain in his leg had settled into a deep, constant burn, no longer sharp, but heavy, like a warning that never stopped whispering. The gunshots came again, 2 this time. Closer. He stopped behind a cluster of low shrubs and listened. The shots weren't wild. They were controlled, deliberate. Whoever was firing knew exactly how much noise they were making and why. That was when the thought finally surfaced, cold and unavoidable. They're drawing someone in. Him. He scanned the ground ahead and noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Footprints. Fresh. Too fresh. They cut across the forest floor at an angle that didn't match natural movement. Someone had walked there recently, not running, not panicking. Patrols. He followed them cautiously, not stepping directly into the prints, but paralleling them from the side. The terrain sloped downward, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger. Somewhere nearby, water was moving. The creek. He found it just beyond a line of trees, narrow, shallow, and slow-moving, barely more than a trickle. Moonlight reflected faintly off its surface, just enough to betray movement. And that's when he saw it. A body, face down in the water. He froze. The uniform was unmistakable. Same cut, same fabric, same mud-stained color he wore himself, one of his unit. He didn't rush forward. Training stopped him. Rushed men died. Instead, he scanned the area, searching for wires, trip flares, anything out of place. Nothing obvious. He crawled closer, heart hammering again, not with fear this time, but with something heavier. The man's helmet had come off, resting awkwardly against a rock. His face was turned sideways, half submerged, eyes open, gone. He swallowed and forced himself to check the surroundings one more time before reaching out. He grabbed the man's collar and pulled gently, turning the body just enough to see the wound. A single shot to the chest, clean, precise, not the chaos of an ambush. This was execution. His jaw tightened. They hadn't just stumbled onto his unit. They'd hunted them, separated them, picked them off one by one. He searched the dead man's pockets quickly, respectfully, and found what he feared. The radio. Cracked, useless. But the antenna had been snapped cleanly in half, not broken by impact, but deliberately bent and torn. The message was clear. You're cut off. He forced himself to move on. Staying with the body helped no one, especially not him. As he followed the creek downstream, he began to notice more signs. Broken branches at shoulder height, mud smeared against tree trunks, drag marks leading off the bank. Someone had been taken alive. The realization sent a chill through him far colder than the night air. If the Germans had a prisoner, they would use him. For information, for bait, for leverage. And suddenly the gunshots made sense. They weren't random. They weren't signals. They were timed. He crouched behind a rock formation as another shot echoed through the woods. This one was closer, much closer. He could hear voices now, not searching, calling out, shouting something in English. "Hello? Can you hear me?" His heart nearly stopped. It was a trap. It had to be. The voice called again, strained, fearful, a man trying to sound calm and failing. His mind raced. No German accent, no obvious mockery. If it was a trick, it was a cruelly convincing one. He risked lifting his head just enough to see. Beyond the trees, in a small clearing, a figure was kneeling, hands tied behind his back, a familiar face smeared with dirt and blood. One of his men. Alive. 2 German soldiers stood nearby, rifles lowered but ready. Another stood back, watching the tree line like a spider waiting for a vibration in its web. And then the prisoner shouted again, "They got me! I'm hit! If anyone's out there, don't leave me!" The words slammed into him harder than any bullet. Every instinct screamed to move, to run, to fire, to do something. But he didn't, because he saw what the prisoner didn't. A thin wire stretched low across the clearing, nearly invisible in the moonlight. A tripwire, connected to something buried just beneath the leaves. A mine. If anyone rushed in, there would be nothing left to save. His throat tightened. This was no longer just about survival. This was about restraint. He watched, helpless, as the German soldier stepped behind the prisoner and raised his pistol, not firing, just resting it against the man's head. The message was unmistakable. Come closer, or watch him die. His injured leg throbbed violently, as if his body was begging him not to move. But his mind was locked in a brutal conflict. If he stayed hidden, the man would be executed. If he moved, he might trigger the mine, or expose himself and die alongside him. Time stretched unbearably. Then something unexpected happened. Another sound cut through the tension. A low rumble. At first it was distant, then closer. Aircraft. Engines in the sky. The German soldiers stiffened, looking up instinctively. The prisoner flinched, hope flashing briefly across his face. The rumble grew louder, unmistakable now. Allied planes. The Germans reacted instantly. Orders were shouted. One soldier grabbed the prisoner and dragged him toward the trees. Another cut the tripwire loose, disabling the trap with practiced efficiency. This wasn't their first time doing this. In seconds, the clearing was empty. Silence returned. He remained frozen long after they were gone, his heart pounding so hard it made him dizzy. They had taken the prisoner. They had proven something far worse. They controlled the ground. They controlled the pace. And now, they knew someone else was out there. Him. The planes passed overhead, never seeing the drama unfolding beneath their wings. And as the sound faded, he understood a terrible truth. He wasn't just being hunted. He was being herded towards something the enemy wanted him to find. He stayed hidden long after the clearing went silent, not because he was frozen by fear, but because he understood something now that hadn't been clear before. The Germans weren't rushing. They weren't panicking. They were moving with purpose, with confidence. That meant they believed time was on their side, and they were right. Night was ending. A thin, grey light began to bleed into the forest, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once you knew it was there. Shadows softened. Shapes gained edges. Darkness, the one ally he had left, was retreating. He forced himself to move. Staying still until dawn would be a death sentence. Once the light fully arrived, he would be nothing more than a wounded man in hostile terrain, with no cover and no speed. He followed the path the Germans had taken, not directly, but at a careful distance. The ground showed signs of their passage, if you knew how to read it. Scuffed leaves, snapped twigs, disturbed soil where boots had dug in for leverage. They were dragging the prisoner. Every few yards, he saw evidence, deep grooves in the dirt, a smear of blood on a stone. It wasn't hard to imagine what the man was going through, and that image nearly broke his focus more than once. But survival required cruelty. He reminded himself again, one man alive is better than two dead. The trail led uphill, toward higher ground where the trees thinned. From there, he could see something new through the branches. Structures, low, angular shapes breaking the natural lines of the forest. Buildings. His heart sank. An outpost. Small, temporary, but fortified. The Germans hadn't just been patrolling. They'd been operating from a forward position, close enough to control movement, far enough to stay hidden from larger Allied advances. And now, the prisoner was being taken straight into it. He dropped low and studied the place from cover. Sandbags stacked around the perimeter. A shallow trench, a radio antenna rising from the center. 2 guard posts positioned to cover the main approach paths. And worse, movement. More soldiers than he'd hoped for. This wasn't something he could assault, not alone, not wounded. He considered turning back. The extraction point was still somewhere west. If he moved now, kept to cover, he might reach friendly lines within a day or two. He might live. But that meant abandoning his captured teammate to interrogation. And interrogation in this war wasn't about questions alone. He clenched his jaw. He waited. Dawn continued its slow, merciless advance. Birds began to call, unaware of the choices being made beneath them. The forest, which had felt hostile and threatening hours earlier, now seemed almost peaceful. That made it worse. He crawled sideways, circling the outpost, searching for weaknesses. Every defensive position had one, even temporary ones, especially temporary ones. Near the rear, he noticed something important. The creek. It flowed directly beneath part of the perimeter, cutting a shallow channel that passed under the sandbags before disappearing downhill. The water wasn't deep, but it was cold, fast enough to distort reflections, and lined with reeds. Cover. He watched as a German soldier crossed near it, stepping carefully to avoid slipping. The man muttered something and laughed with another guard. Careless. That was the difference between occupying land and defending it. He waited until the guards rotated, counted the steps, timed the pauses, learned the rhythm. Then he moved. He slid into the creek, biting back a gasp as icy water flooded his boots and soaked into his clothes. The shock nearly took his breath away, but he forced it down. He let the current carry him slowly, inch by inch, until he was beneath the overhang of sandbags. From there, he pressed himself into the mud, keeping his silhouette low and his movements slow. Voices drifted above him. Boots passed within feet of his head. He stayed still. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, when the sound of footsteps faded, he pulled himself up just enough to see into the camp. The prisoner was there, tied to a post near the central structure, head hanging, alive, but barely. A German officer stood nearby, speaking calmly, gesturing occasionally, like a teacher explaining a lesson. The prisoner didn't respond. The officer nodded to one of the soldiers. The soldier raised his fist and brought it down hard. The prisoner slumped. His stomach turned. He had seconds to decide. A distraction might work. A single shot. Fire, then move. Chaos favored the desperate. But one shot would bring every rifle in the camp down on him. And then he saw it. The radio tent. Lightly guarded, essential. Without it, coordination would collapse. Without it, the outpost would be blind and deaf. He shifted his weight, testing his injured leg again. Pain flared, but it held. Barely. He checked his remaining ammunition. Enough for one decisive action, not a firefight, a message. He lined up his shot carefully, ignoring the tremor in his hands, focusing on the objective, not the man being beaten, not the fear, not the pain. The radio. He exhaled slowly, pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the equipment inside the tent, sparks flashing briefly as metal shattered. Shouts erupted instantly, alarms, confusion. Guards spun, rifles swinging wildly. He didn't wait. He dropped back into the creek, letting the water swallow him as bullets snapped into the mud and sandbags above. He moved downstream fast now, ignoring the pain, letting survival override everything else. Behind him, the outpost exploded into activity. Orders shouted, men running. Radios crackling uselessly. He had done what he could. He had bought time. For the prisoner, for himself. But as he dragged himself out of the creek farther downhill, gasping, soaked and shaking, he knew something else just as clearly. The Germans would not let this go. They would hunt him harder now, because he had stopped being just a wounded soldier trying to escape. He had become a problem, and dawn was fully here. The forest no longer belonged to him. With daylight fully settled, everything had changed. Shadows were thinner, cover was weaker. Every movement felt exposed, like walking across an open field with invisible eyes watching. He moved anyway. Pain had become background noise, constant, dull and relentless. His leg felt heavier with every step, soaked bandage stiff against his skin. Infection was a future problem. Shock was a present one. But stopping wasn't an option. Behind him, the outpost was alive with pursuit. He heard it in the distance, whistles, shouted orders, the unmistakable sound of dogs being released. Not one, several. They were done playing. He forced himself downhill, choosing uneven terrain where vehicles couldn't follow easily. Roots tore at his boots. Branches clawed his uniform. He welcomed it, anything that slowed them even slightly. The dogs' barking echoed through the trees, closer now, sharper. He altered his path, cutting across rocky ground, stepping deliberately through water when he could, doubling back once to confuse the scent. Each trick bought seconds, maybe minutes, not enough. His breath grew ragged. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He stumbled once, caught himself against a tree, and nearly screamed when pain shot through his leg. Keep moving. That was all that existed now. Then he saw it. The stone wall, broken, half collapsed, covered in moss and time. The same one he remembered from the approach hours, no, a lifetime ago. Relief hit him so hard it almost dropped him to his knees. Orientation. Hope. Beyond the wall, the terrain opened slightly, sloping toward land that should lead toward friendly lines. But the barking was very close now. He crossed the wall with effort, scraping his injured leg badly as he slid down the other side. Warm blood spread again, undoing everything he'd tried to control. He didn't stop to fix it. He couldn't. Gunfire cracked behind him. A bullet struck stone inches from his head. They had visual. He ran. Not fast, not well, but with everything he had left. Trees blurred past. His lungs burned like fire. Each step felt like driving a nail into his leg, but adrenaline carried him forward, pushing him past limits he hadn't known existed. Another shot. Closer. Then something new. A deep, distant thud. Artillery. Not German. Allied. He nearly laughed. He forced himself onward, waving one arm weakly as he broke from the tree line into a partially open field. Smoke hung in the distance. The sound of battle rolled across the ground like thunder, and then voices, English, shouting. Rough hands grabbed him as he collapsed forward, strength finally gone. Rifles swung past him, soldiers yelling for medics, dragging him back toward cover. He barely registered it. His world narrowed to fragments. Sky, smoke, noise, pain. As he faded in and out, he heard someone say it. "Jesus, he came from there?" Someone else answered quietly. "He shouldn't be alive." He survived. That's the word history would use. But survival came with a cost no report could capture. His unit didn't all make it back. The prisoner was never seen again. The outpost was abandoned days later after a larger Allied push. But that didn't undo what had already happened in the forest. For the rest of his life, he remembered the sounds most clearly. Boots in leaves, dogs breathing in the dark, a single gunshot echoing where no one should have been alone. War doesn't end when you reach friendly lines. It follows you home. It lives in the silence between thoughts, in the moments before sleep, in the memories that surface without warning. He wasn't a hero in the way stories like to describe. He didn't charge machine guns or raise flags. He endured. And sometimes that's the hardest fight of all. Because staying alive isn't about glory. It's about carrying what you survived, long after the shooting stops.